Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz double bassist and composer Martin Nevin. His latest CD is Tenderness is Silent, and he is leading his own quintet on this debut recording featuring 11 original compositions. He talked about growing up in Los Angeles, going to the Manhattan School of Music, performing with Albert Tootie Heath, Billy Hart, Greg Osby, Jason Moran, and so many others, along with this brand new record. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Martin, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
You bet. So talk to me about your latest CD, Tenderness is Silent. You lead your own quintet, your debut album, 11 originals. Talk to me about how you feel about this album now that it's out.
It feels good. It feels like it was necessary for me because I've done a lot of work kind of helping people, play their music and sort of actualize their vision for what they see, what they see their music being, basically. And this was a chance for me to express the way I see it, sort of my vision for how I see not just music, but I think how I see the world. That's sort of, the music is a reflection of that. It feels a little strange because it's really personal. It's like, I don't know, showing someone your most private objects, like taking them into your room and showing them all these really personal things. Like, that's how I feel about the album in a way, is that it's something really, I don't know if the right word is intimate, but it's kind of private and personal. And so that's a little bit strange, but I'm getting more used to that. And I think it's been nice to hear the feedback that people connect to it in a certain way, that people have some kind of reaction to it, and that helps me, I don't know, feel more comfortable moving forward with what I'm doing.
Right on. So let me ask you this. Did you grow up in L.A.?
I did, yeah.
Okay. So talk to me about, growing up in L.A., how you got involved in music and more specifically jazz.
My mom's a music teacher. She was my music teacher in school, in kindergarten through 6th grade. So that was kind of an interesting experience. I was always getting in trouble, kind of fooling around. But music was always something really important in my house. My dad is a cinematographer and also has a really deep love for music, plays piano. And both my parents are immigrants from the Soviet Union. They're both Russian. And I think just have a really they always had a really special place for music in the house we grew up in. Just a very kind of I want to say emotional connection to what music can do and how moving it can be and how expressive it can be. There was always kind of an emphasis on that in my house, which is very nice, which is, not the case for a lot of people growing up, and some musicians have to kind of find it on their own later. But there was always a lot of music around, but not so much jazz. My parents are big kind of classical music buffs. They like jazz, and they sort of had an interest before, but I got into jazz sort of around the time I was maybe 13. And there was just a few friends of mine who kind of were going through the same thing, where we were hearing jazz and we were like, whoa, what is this? This is amazing. But there weren't a lot of people around. For example, in my school, I went to just kind of a regular private college prep type school where there was no jazz band at all. When I got to middle school, there was nothing. And so some of the older students decided they wanted to form a little club, basically, that met once a week. And it started with that, and then my friends and I, we went to the school and we kind of said, can you make this a class? Can you help us do this? And so we had basically our class was a combo. It was never a big band. There were only 6 or 7 people. and that was the first jazz class at my school. So we were kind of trying to create our own education in a way. And luckily we had a great teacher, a pianist named Greg Smith, who he lived in Chicago for a while, and then he came to LA. And I feel like he was just really important in, I don't know, he shaped a lot of my ideas at the time about playing, about what music to check out. But I never had that sort of classic school big band education that I think when I got to college I realized a lot of the people I was going to school with had. And they knew about all this. You know, when I got to college it was like everyone had been in these Grammy bands and all this stuff I had never heard of. I just showed up and realized that like my background was much different. I guess specifically in terms of a moment I remember with jazz was when we just started with that sort of jazz, basically club. We had this teacher come in and he handed us a chart for Straight No Chaser. And so I bought the record. I'd never heard Monk or anything like that before. And I started listening to the record and I was completely blown away, but I could not understand how it worked. Because I'd played, a blues before, like very basic version, but I was looking at the chart and listening over and over again to the track, and I couldn't figure out how all these extra chords worked. I just remember it was a combination of just complete confusion with also just being astounded by what I was hearing. And I'll never forget that moment of putting that record on, and I listened to it so many times.
Talk to me a little bit about after you got out of the Manhattan School of Music, and talk to me a little bit about how your career kind of started and how you kind of progressed.
It's a good question. I think if I would say my career probably started already while I was in school, because I was meeting a lot of the people who I would continue to work with and after school. And I think that was one of the best parts, honestly, of Manhattan School, was just the musicians I met were of such a high level. There were just some really special people that I really am lucky to have met. So I guess I had started working while I was in college, just doing gigs here and there, and then it's hard to say exactly how it worked out. You kind of meet one person, meet another person who knows them, start doing a little bit of a tour. To be more specific about how it got going, it just sort of takes a little bit of time of establishing certain connections with people, and also those connections that make sense. I think there's so many musicians in New York, for example, they all play quote-unquote jazz, and there's an assumption maybe that everyone would love playing with everyone else because there's this big umbrella term that we're all kind of falling under. But I think music is a lot more personal than that. So the people who kind of their ideas about music really make sense to you, I think gradually over time you gravitate towards each other. And that's how people's careers kind of get formed, is over time you get drawn closer to the people where the connection really makes sense. So I think that's kind of what started to happen after school is I would work with a lot of different people and different things, and over time maybe those connections got like more specific, where I was working with people where it really made sense, where like what they were trying to do made sense with the way I played bass for their music and so forth, if that makes sense.
It does. Totally does make sense. So what have you learned from like veterans and masters, like, playing with Tootie Heath and Billy Hart and Ethan Iverson and Aaron Parks? What do you get from being around people that have had so much experience in their lives?
Well, I guess I'll just talk about Tootie a little bit, because I met Tootie the first time I was 15, and I went to this Stanford jazz workshop. I didn't know that much. It was my first time kind of being around a lot of other young musicians who played jazz and who could play and were really into it. It was really exciting for me. And then there were all these great people teaching there. I just remember Tootie, of course, the Heath brothers came in that year too. So Percy was there and Jimmy, and Tootie was kind of always there every year. He was sort of a staple of that program. And I remember one day going to one of my classes, and I came to the room, and Tootie was just sitting there at the drum set, and there was no one else in the room. And he said, "Do you want to hear a siren going by?"
Yeah, that's cool. You're good.
Tootie says, "Do you want to play a tune?" And I was probably terrified, but I remember we played "Have You Met Miss Jones" just as a duo. And he was playing brushes, and that was one of those moments where I wanted to do that. I wanted to play that music, and you could just feel, I mean, even as a 15-year-old where you really don't know that much and I don't think understand exactly what's happening, I think there's something so special when he plays the drums that I felt at that moment. It was an incredible, incredible moment. And then years later, I kind of saw him a few times over the years, and then, let's see, about 4 years ago or so, there was a trio with Ethan Iverson, Ben Street, and Tootie, and I did some gigs with them filling in for Ben, who's been sort of, I would say, kind of a mentor to me and a teacher, and that was an incredible experience. And I think I was, at a place in my life, at a place in my musical career where I could really appreciate it more. And for me, I think as a bass player, probably for anyone, but really as a bass player, playing with an older drummer is just the absolute best thing you could possibly do. It's the most exciting thing that you can imagine. If being a soccer player, playing in the World Cup final is the dream, I would say playing with a real old master on the drums is kind of the dream for a jazz bassist, in my mind at least. You get in touch, I think, with something that feels so authentic. If you imagine jazz as being a folk music, and really black folk music, then you feel like you're actually getting in touch with that element, which is it's something that gets passed down through playing. And for someone who, I grew up in LA, I was born in 1988. I grew up in this place that was very removed, if you think about where jazz came from, where all of this happened and started. We're pretty, at least for me, grew up pretty far from that. And a lot of it is sort of just hearing records and kind of trying to figure out what does any of this mean, and it's so different from my life. This music was born out of circumstances and situations that are so different from mine. So it's like, how do you access that? How do you get closer to sort of the real thing? And I think playing with Tootie really allowed me to do that. And also just the feeling of it, which is hard to describe because it's something very abstract. The feeling of just getting to play those rhythms with him, it's the best. It's kind of indescribable. So that was, and I've gotten to work with him a little bit since then too. I have a friend who's a piano player, named Richard Sears, who's written some music that sort of featured Tootie, and gotten to do some concerts with that, and it's always just a learning experience, and a real pleasure.
Yeah.
So
why do you love jazz?
I think your relationship to music of any kind is always changing. So I feel like my love for jazz and my relationship to it is changed over the years, and maybe the answer I would give you would be different 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 2 years ago, because I feel like you're always sort of reevaluating what that relationship is. Why do I love jazz? I think for me, improvising is something I feel is really a part of me. It's something that is just part of the way I think I am able to express something, I'm able to say something, is through the experience of improvising for people who are listening, sort of feeding off the energy and creating something completely new spontaneously. I just really connect to that experience. And I think, again, jazz isn't the only music where you improvise, but that's a huge part. And I think I just love jazz because, I don't know, the simple experience of being really moved by it. There's no real intellectual reason I can say besides the fact that when I put certain records on, they just make me feel something. They really impact me. And the greats, the jazz sort of greats, the most important people, their music just really gets me. And that hasn't changed at all. Like listening to Monk or Duke, Bird, it's just this feeling of getting something really, getting to something really deep inside of me, and I don't know what that is, and I'll try to understand that as I go, but it's unmistakable.
I love that answer. That's exactly the way it is. Let me ask you this. Everyone has a version of you. Everyone has a perception of who they think you are. Your family, your friends, your fans, colleagues. But you know yourself best. Who do you think you are?
That's a really interesting question. Because I think there's something interesting that happens with my music. Okay, let me go backwards a little bit. I think when you meet me, or people who are friends with me or know me see me as very kind of like a funny guy, maybe joking around a lot and lighthearted, pretty relaxed. And I think my music reveals like another side of me that's maybe much more serious and much more private. So in terms of your question, like, how do people perceive me? I think the people closest to me in my life understand the side of me and know it that comes out with my compositions, with my music. But people who don't know me that well might be a little bit surprised when they hear my music. And I think part of it is even the people who know me best in my life, I feel like there are some things that I really can only express in my music. And that's kind of what the title of the album has to do with, is this idea of tenderness is silent, that in terms of words, there's something that just can't be said. Some side of me that I feel can't quite be expressed in words that comes out in this music. So in terms of seeing different sides of my personality, I think the music is kind of an entry point to a certain side of me that people don't always see.
That's a great answer. Martin, I saved the hardest one for last. Thank you for taking some time out for me today to talk about the new album, to talk about your life and music. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Los Angeles, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Martin for his time, his cool, and his stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.